great turnout tonight. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your schedules to come out a beautiful evening here, and instead of relaxing at home, you're sitting in a public meeting to talk about the future of our country. That says a lot about the concern that people have in the direction we're taking. This is my 51st town hall meeting. Let me ask you, just for make some noise or show of hands or something, how many of you think that this administration has us on the right track? How many of you think it's got us going on the wrong track? People understand that we've got a great discussion that's going on right now among the American people over the future direction of our country. I tell folks all the time that the debates that go on in Washington are really merely a reflection of a much larger debate that's going on right now all across America. It's going on over backyard fences and over family dinner tables. It's going on over coffee at Starbucks. And it really is upon the outcome of that debate that the future of our country will be decided. We have two very different paths to take. The good news is we know how to revive an economy. We've done so many times before. When people say that this is the worst economy since the Great Depression, I don't know about you, but I remember a time much more recently when we had double-digit unemployment, double-digit inflation, mile-long lines around gas stations, interest rates at 21.5%. Maybe we don't remember those days as vividly because they didn't last very long. That was the end of the Carter administration. We elected Ronald Reagan, who diagnosed the country's problems very differently than today's leadership. You remember his first inaugural address when he said, in this great economic crisis, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem.
Amen.
He dramatically reduced the tax and regulatory burden that was crushing our economy, and he produced one of the most prolonged periods of economic expansion in our nation's history. And it wasn't just him. John F. Kennedy did the same thing in the early 1960s with the same results. Calvin Coolidge did the same thing in the early 1920s with the same results. People forget, Harry S. Truman in 1945 abolished the excess profits tax, slashed the federal income tax rates. In 1946, Harry Truman took the federal budget from $85 billion down to $30 billion in a single day, or in a single year. Fired 10 million federal employees. 10 million. Called war demobilization. The Keynesians at the time warned that this was going to produce 25% unemployment and a second Great Depression, and instead it produced the entire post-war economic boom. And we don't even have to go back that far to see the results of good policy. Bill Clinton, you remember after the drubbing he took in 1994, you remember what he said after that? Remember his announcement, the era of big government is over. And he acted on that. He cut federal spending as a percentage of GDP by a miraculous 4%. He attacked entitlement spending. He abolished that entire open-ended welfare system we had at the time. He signed what amounted to the biggest capital gains tax cut in American history. He produced 4 budget surpluses, the only 4 budget surpluses in more than 40 years. And the result was a period of prolonged economic expansion and prosperity. So we know what works. We also know what doesn't work. Confronting the recession of 1929, Herbert Hoover addressed the issue, first by a massive tax increase called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was a steep tax increase on about 20,000 imported products. He ultimately took the federal income tax rate, I believe, from 25% to 63%. He increased federal spending by about 60% in 4 years. Just 4 years' time. And he turned the recession in 1929 into the Depression of the 1930s. Franklin Roosevelt simply doubled down on those policies, and the result was we lost an entire decade. And again, you don't have to go back that far to see the results of bad public policy. Look at the George W. Bush administration. He increased spending by 2% of GDP. He didn't attack entitlement spending like Bill Clinton. He actually presided over the biggest expansion of entitlement spending since the Great Society. He started this whole era of stimulus spending. Remember all those $600 checks we got in the spring of 2008 that was supposed to revive the economy and keep us from slipping into a recession? Remember that? So this is not Republicans versus Democrats. This is policies that work and policies that don't work. And we've got plenty of experience with both. We're now in the 5th year of policies predicated on the assumption that if government just can pump enough money into the economy, it'll jumpstart consumer spending, and consumers will start spending more. And the problem with that is very simply this. It doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it can't work. Government cannot inject a dollar into the economy until it first takes that dollar out of the economy. It's true, if I take a dollar from Peter and give it to Paul, Paul's got an extra dollar to spend. Paul's going to take that into a local shop. The shopkeeper's going to order more inventory. The manufacturer's going to order more resources. That dollar's going to ripple through the economy. That is all perfectly sound. The problem is they completely forget the other half of the equation. Peter now has one less dollar to spend in that very same economy, one less dollar to ripple through the economy. And that's why, as experience has repeatedly shown us, income transfers result to zero economic growth, at least on paper. Often they net to much less than zero economic growth because we end up transferring huge amounts of capital from investment decisions that would have been made based on the highest economic return on that dollar. And we transfer that capital into the government sector where the decision is made in investing on the highest political return on that dollar. That's the difference between Apple Computer and Solyndra. So we're at a turning point. We need to choose which path we're going to take, whether we continue down the one we are on, or whether we return to policies that have served us so well in the past. And it can be summed up in a single word: freedom. Freedom works. I think it's time that we put it back to work. That's what we're doing on the House Budget Committee. We've now passed 3 budgets over the last 3 years. We've put the country back on the path of fiscal solvency that avert the financial collapse of the Medicare system, which the Medicare actuaries are telling us will occur in less than 10 years, and putting Social Security back on a sound financial footing. The Social Security Trust Fund is warning us that it will bankrupt in the next 20 years. And it's not something that you can wait 20 years to address. It has to be addressed now because every year that we delay, the changes that have to be made are that much more dramatic and that much more painful. So that's one of the great issues that, back then, my judgment, is the great issue that we're confronting. You remember about 3 years ago, Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned us that, in his judgment, the greatest threat to our nation's security was our national debt. You go back and look, when he gave that speech, the national debt was about $13.5 trillion. Today it's well over $16.5 trillion, which means that just in the time since he made that warning, we have added more to the nation's debt than we had acquired in the first 200 years of our nation's history. That's how fast things are spinning out of control. If I can leave you with anything as we talk about the finances of our country and the impact that that's having on our economy, on our future security, and not to mention the future of our children. Remember this: every $1 billion that we throw around in Washington, think of that as $9 out of your family's budget, $9 off of your kitchen table, because that's what it is. There are about 114 million households in America. Divide that into $1 billion, it's about $9 per household. And to those who say, oh, well, we can tax business, we don't have to tax people, we can tax business. Just remember that businesses don't pay business taxes. Businesses collect business taxes, and there are only 3 places they can collect them from. They collect them from us as consumers through higher prices. They collect them from us as employees through lower wages. And they collect them from us as investors through lower earnings, mainly on our 401ks. Those are the only 3 possible ways that a business tax can be collected. So when we talk about running a deficit of $1 trillion a year, each year for the past 4 years, more than $1 trillion. $800 billion estimated this year. Every $1 trillion is about $9,000 out of the future earnings of our families. And it's not a theoretical number. That is real money that you will be required to repay from your future taxes just as surely as if it appeared on your credit card statement. In fact, you're required to pay that back before you pay back your credit card statement. That's why these issues are so important. The amount of money that we're throwing around so cavalierly has a huge impact on the prosperity of our country. If you think of $1 trillion as $9,000 from your family's earnings, $1 billion is $9 from your family's earnings. That'll give you a reference point, a real-world reference point to decide whether this spending that we're doing is worthwhile. So that's the budget side of the equations. I'm also on the Natural Resources Committee, and we are dealing with issues that jurisdiction has a huge impact over the economy of our local region. Everything from timber harvesting to tourism. We've had a series of meetings over the Merced River Plan, which I have been told is of great concern to all of the businesses in our communities that depend upon tourism for commerce. As you know, that's the lifeblood of our communities here. I've often warned that tourists don't go where they're not welcome, and a plan that tears out the bicycle rentals and the rafting rentals, the equestrian activities at our national park in Yosemite is going to have a profound impact on tourism. In fact, I met today with the leadership of Yosemite Park. They assure me that they are taking the public's concerns into consideration as they deliberate over this plan. I can tell you that I think the diplomats would call it, we had a frank exchange of opinions on the subject. And I warned that the public owns Yosemite, and the public, and the park system works for the public, and and the responsibility of the park system is to welcome and encourage the public to the public's lands. It's not there to harass and restrict them. We'll see what develops. I was somewhat heartened by the meeting that we had today, but I think a great deal of additional work is going to need to be done, and there we need to hear from every member of the community over the next few weeks, and I certainly encourage you to do that. That's basically what I came here to say. The rest of the evening is yours. I've got microphones here. Who's doing the microphone tonight? Norman Gonzalez, who's my Director of Community Outreach for the district office, and Captain Rocky Deal, our district director. Rocky is in charge of the entire district, which stretches from Lake Tahoe past Yosemite all the way down to Fresno County. It is a huge, it's bigger. This district is actually bigger than some states. We're in very good hands with Rocky, who's the former commanding officer of the great aircraft carrier USS Constellation. So we're very, very fortunate to have him. I also see Eagle Berman, my chief of staff, back here, and Kristen Glenn's around here someplace. She's my legislative director outside, and Bill George, my press secretary. So with that, the rest of the evening is yours. Just raise a hand and get one of the guys with mics to come.
Hi, my name is Ann Brock. I didn't know where to start, but I thought I'd start with the debt. I read an article in Harper's Magazine recently by an economist, Jeff Maverick. Our debt has stabilized as a percentage of GDP. It's forecast to begin falling in 2015. It's now running about 5% of GDP compared with 10% in 2009. 2013, it will fall below the $1 trillion mark, and healthcare costs are down as well. So right now, borrowing costs are very low. Is this really a time to focus so heavily on the debt that we don't take care of our people? Or is the debt issue getting a little exaggerated?
Actually, the only reason the debt is down as a percentage of GDP is because we just had a massive tax increase in January. And I'm very concerned about the impact that that's going to have on the overall economy. If you want to know the problem we've got with the federal budget, you need to know three numbers: 39, 39.37.64. You got that? 39.37.64. 39% is the increase in inflation and population combined over the last 10 years. 37% is the increase in revenues in the same period. That's despite the recession, despite the Bush tax cuts, and that's before the massive tax increases in January. Our revenues were pretty much keeping pace with inflation and population growth. It's the third number that's killing it. 64% is the increase in federal spending in the same period. You're correct that over the next couple of years, it is projected that that debt will trend down as a percentage of GDP, but then it goes right back up again. The CBO is projecting 5% a year annual growth for the federal budget. Remember what our country's economic growth is right now, about 1.1%, something like that. You can see that the growth of government will fast outstrip the economy's ability to bear it. It is simply not sustainable. The Ryan budget bends that curve down to the point where it does balance with revenues. One more thing that I ought to point out. As I said, the debt is down right now as a percentage of GDP because of the increase in taxes. But taxes are not an antidote to debt. Taxes and debt are the same thing. A debt is simply a future tax. Once government has spent the money, it's already decided to tax it. The only question is whether it is taxed now out of the current economy or whether it is borrowed now and taxed by the future. And we all know from our own experience, if you live beyond your means today, of necessity you're going to have to live below your means in the future. That's what we're doing to our kids. So the tax increases were not a solution to debt. This has always been a spending problem. The solution to our nation's fiscal crisis is to reduce spending. Again, revenues, keeping pace with inflation and population. It's the spending that's killing us. It's got to be a spending side.
I'm here about my big concern and why I'm here is because what's happening in Yosemite Valley. I don't know who are these people or government hires to decide to get rid of the rafting, the horseback riding, and now I'm hearing the church, because it's right there by the river. The tourist was in town the other day and she was all upset she can't even have a wedding in 2014. She was told, I don't know who told her, that the church was coming down with the oak tree. So where do we stop bringing Yosemite Valley back to?
Well,
and I don't know, who's making these decisions? And I went to the last meeting and they say, well, write to us and we will consider it, but we'll look at it. So it's like, do we have a fight? I mean, because I don't want the raft. My kids grew up here. We grew up rafting, horseback riding. They say they're going to take out the 2-hour rides. Well, I can't afford a 4-hour ride. I can barely afford the 2-hour ride. I can't afford the heavy-duty raft. You can't just take any raft up there. They pop. You need one of those heavy army ones. And they're saying, we're going to put a 200 parking lot in El Patel. Okay, I can't bring my raft and my bikes and my ice chest on a bus. This is just ridiculous. I'm here because I'm angry and it's ridiculous. And why would I go to the park? And I think it's going to hit us economically really hard here in Mariposa.
no, I have no doubt
So
of
how
that.
do you stop that?
By screaming from the highest mountaintops. Again, public opinion matters. It truly does. My advice is, write letters to the editor, call into talk shows. My sense of it is that the general public is only just now beginning to realize what this Merced Plan would do to the recreational opportunities at Yosemite Valley. And remember, Yosemite is about to celebrate its 150th anniversary. It was in 1864 that President Abraham Lincoln signed the act creating the Yosemite Valley as a national park. And you remember the purpose for that?
For the people.
Exactly, for public recreation in perpetuity. That was the purpose. These are the public's lands. The public has every right to the perpetual enjoyment of those lands, and the Park Service is there to serve the public, not to hinder them. What I have discovered over my years in Congress, and I've now represented Lake Tahoe now. This is my 5th year representing Lake Tahoe, which is under the general control of the National Forest Service. We have seen an attitude creep into our public lands policy, and I sit on the Public Lands Subcommittee of Natural Resources, so I've got a front row seat watching this intrusion of a radical and retrograde ideology into our public lands management. And it basically be summed up as people are a bane to Mother Nature, and we have to move them off. We have to get the public off the public's lands. And so we see in the Forest Service areas, we see roads being closed, we see cabins being forced off lands that have been leased there for generations. We see grazing operations being shut down. We see the public simply being forced. We see the timber industry absolutely devastated throughout this region. You know, long ago, a forester told me that, you know, all that excess timber in the forest, that's going to be taken out one way or the other. It will either be burned out or it will be carried out, but it is going to come out. I guarantee that. When we carried it out, we had much healthier forests and we had a much healthier economy. Since this attitude began permeating our public lands policy, we have devastated the local economy, and at the same time, we've devastated the forest. We now suffer much more frequent and ferocious forest fires because of the benign neglect that has been visited on these public lands. So, frankly, I see this as part of a general ideology that is highly exclusionary in nature. It is not the first time we've seen this. If you look back in your history, during Norman and Plantagenet in England, the Crown set aside about 1/3 of the acreage of southern England. How much, by the way, is owned by the federal government of Mariposa these days? I heard 55 or so. Supervisor Kenn's here. Do you remember how much?
I think about 40%.
40%. 1/3 of the land area of southern Britain was set aside as the royal forest. The commoners were supposed to keep out of it. They were the exclusive preserve of the crown and the crown's favorites and the crown's foresters. And that was so irritating to the English people that no few policy before. By the way, 40% of Mariposa County owned by the federal government. Just as a point of reference, anybody know what percentage of land the federal government owns in the District of Columbia, in our nation's capital? All the government buildings, all of the mall, all of the memorials and parks. You know how much of the land area of Washington, D.C. is owned by the federal government? 25%. The federal government owns 25% of our nation's capital. They own 40% of Mariposa County. What's wrong with that picture?
Well, what is wrong with it?
What's wrong with
What
it
is wrong with that?
is that because every acre that is taken by the federal government is one less acre available for productive use for our economy.
I'm sorry, there's a lot of people who are drawn to those public lands who enjoy recreating on them.
Sir, we're not going to get into a shouting match here. Raise your hand and we'll get something.
Welcome. My name is Marvin Wells. I have 5 questions, but you've already answered one, so I'm only going to answer one question and give the rest of the chance, since they don't, I'll come back. Would you vote for a balanced budget amendment and also support legislation requiring that the President, as well as the Congress, forfeit their pay each day the budget is late, to include no retroactive reimbursements?
Okay. First of all, I've not only voted for a balanced budget amendment, I've actually offered a balanced budget amendment. It was 27 words. I think it fits in the entire framework of the Constitution, which gets its beauty from its elegance in its simplicity. Basically, what it says is that the federal government cannot increase the nation's debt except for a stated purpose approved by 3/4 of the Congress. It trusts 3/4 of the Congress to know a genuine crisis when it sees one, and it trusts 1/4 of the Congress to be able to resist self-indulgent incentives to borrow from our kids and grandkids to pay for our own spending. Now, with respect to the second part of your question, we've had such a measure. I voted against it. The reason I voted against it was this. We don't want our representatives voting against their conscience, against their best judgment, simply because their rent check is due. That is a very, very dangerous connection to make. We have an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that says that the compensation of Congress cannot be raised or lowered during the current session of the Congress. And the reason for that is we do not want our representatives voting based upon how much they, what bills they have due. We don't want them to put their own personal financial interest ahead of their judgment for the country's interests. I think that's a very, very dangerous road to go down. You don't want to cross those wires.
Hello. I enjoyed the town hall meeting last night, and we are back to gather more information. My name is Wendy Brown Berry, and my husband Kevin Berry and I are founding members of Yosemite for Everyone. And we are a group of dedicated individuals and concerned citizens. We believe in a common sense approach to preservation where visitors' use is balanced with protecting the environment. We support recreational activities that have been traditionally and historically enjoyed for 150 years. I do have a question for you this evening. The environmental impact report came out in January. That's 3 months to go through 2,500 pages. Your recommendation was beat the drums. We're doing that. We have a call to action letter out. We are going to various groups, the mountain riders. We are putting the word out. We're trying to get public interest. And in doing so, we're finding out in our local communities that a lot of people have no clue. Just coming here this evening, we ran into a young man and he goes, "What? Huh?" And so they don't know. So also the general public in the surrounding communities has no idea until recently that the park was planning on removing all the commercial recreational activities within the park. And they're concerned about how this will affect our local economies and people of lower socioeconomic status. The Park Service is also not considering visitors from further away in our state, other states, Europe. So what we are asking is for you to help us obtain a 90-day extension on all 3 plans for public comment, so those who have been overlooked will have adequate time to respond. Can you help us with that?
Well, yes, in fact, I made that request of the park management about 3 hours ago in Yosemite. We'll be doing a formal letter next week, and I'm told we will be joined by Congressman Sam Farr, whose leftist credentials are impeccable. He's a congressman from the Santa Clara area. I served with him in the state legislature 30 years ago. No one can question his liberal credentials or his environmental credentials. He, I'm told, has reached out to our office to join in a request for an extension of comments because the public is only now becoming, I think, fully aware, the general public, becoming aware of the proposals for Yosemite Valley. I think that's absolutely essential. There are a number of different avenues that we're pursuing. One is standalone legislation that basically forbids the destruction of these facilities. A second would be amendments to appropriations acts involving Park Service funding, which would forbid the expenditure of funds for the destruction of these facilities. Another avenue, in addition to the extension, is to call for a congressional investigation of this plan, its ramifications, and who's responsible for it. As I said, I sit on the subcommittee that oversees the National Park Service, and I feel fairly confident that we'll be able to get a hearing on that. So those are the avenues that we're pursuing right now.
So the issues I addressed last night, you feel are important and that we can take it to the next level.
I think they're absolutely vital.
Thank you.
The economy of these communities depend, here in Mariposa, how much of your economy depends upon tourism? I suspect a very substantial portion of it. As I said, tourists don't go where they're not welcome. You take out the amenities from the park, you adopt this elitist exclusionary policy that we see permeating in both the Forest Service and the Park Service. Yosemite competes with hundreds of other state and federal parks, not to mention all sorts of other recreational options. If people encounter too many hassles, if they find the amenities being removed from Yosemite, they'll simply vote with their feet. They'll go elsewhere. And that means they won't be passing through town. They won't be staying in town. They won't be availing themselves of all of the hospitality of the gateway communities. And that will be devastating. Remember when they shut down the timber industry? They told us, oh, don't worry about that, we'll always have tourism. And now it appears they're trying to shut down the tourism industry. Well, I think at some point we've got to put our foot down and say that is our land, we are the public, you work for us, and your job is to welcome us to our own lands.
Yeah, thank you, amen, thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah, but before we go to the second round, I want to be sure everybody who wants to speak has a chance. This gentleman here was quite anxious.
I think as residents of Mariposa County, we all need to recognize that we all enjoy and recreate on our county's BLM, Forest Service, and Park Service lands. Who among us does not enjoy hiking, biking, riding, camping, fishing, and swimming on these lands? And yet the sequester that just passed is going to result in the closure of some 670 Forest Service campgrounds nationwide, as well as the Bryceburg Road in our own Berry County. So I find your discussion that Yosemite managers are doing, or government managers are doing more to keep people off the land that we all own somewhat specious. I'd also like to point out that in November, the voters of our great state passed a ballot initiative that allowed a tax increase. With that, our state's budget problems disappeared. How can you then say that some form of tax increase on the federal level, especially on the very wealthy, cannot help us balance our federal budget?
Okay, first question, sorry, I have to break this down. First question is on the public lands, what's the point?
Yeah, the fact that the sequester took $85 billion away from our federal land management agencies and all other agencies, while this terrible tax increase that passed on the federal level only raises half that much annually.
I got it. First of all, you got to understand what the sequester is. I opposed the Budget Control Act that adopted the sequester for a large number of reasons. One of them is I oppose the across-the-board nature of the cuts that treats your highest priority the same as your lowest priority. That's just dumb. And secondly, it was wholly inadequate to protect the AAA credit rating of the United States government. Standard & Poor's warned us at the time that we needed to reduce the federal budget projected deficit by at least $4 trillion over the next 10 years to maintain the AAA credit rating of our government. The Budget Control Act, which includes the sequester, only reduced it by about $1.2 trillion over 10 years, less than a third of the minimum the Standard & Poor's said was necessary to maintain our AAA credit rating. Now let's get all of this in perspective. We spend over $3.5 trillion a year. The sequester is $85 billion of authorization, but the way it's been watered down is only about 22 actual spending reductions between now and the end of the year. Now the budget continues to grow. This is a reduction in the increase, not an actual cut in the conventional sense of the term. Now, after but let's use the highest number, $85 billion out of a $3.5 trillion budget. That's about 2.5%. Now, after 10 years in which federal spending has grown 64%, you mean to tell me the federal government cannot reduce its projected growth by 2.5%? Now, we see how the sequester is being implemented. In fact, there are several memos that have surfaced from the administration to the various agencies, essentially saying, We want these cuts to be visible. And the prime example of that was the announcement by the White House last month that they were going to cancel tours. They were going to close the People's House to the people. All of the school groups that had scrimped and saved for their trip to Washington to see the White House, all those tours were canceled. Now that saves about $18,000 a week. You know how much it costs to operate Air Force One? $180,000 an hour. Now, managing the government is about making choices, about setting priorities. Let me ask all of you, if you had a choice to save $18,000 by closing the People's House to the people and disappointing all those school groups, or operating Air Force One for an average of 6 minutes less a week, which choice would you make?
Air Force One.
Which choice did the president make? So that's what this question is being administered. The other part of your question again, I'm sorry, was on
tax increase.
Yeah, why?
Oh, yes, yes.
California
We
solution
balanced
works better.
the state's budget and ended all of our fiscal problems with a tax increase. I would invite you to watch those numbers very, very carefully. We've been down this road several times before. Under Republican administrations, Wilson imposed what was then the biggest tax increase by any state in American history in 1991. That was supposed to solve our state's budget crisis. It made it worse. That year, the rest of the country was coming out of the recession. We stayed in the recession for 2 more years because of the damage that the 1991 Pete Wilson tax increases did to our economy. Not learning from that lesson, you may recall that Arnold Schwarzenegger then broke Wilson's record and imposed what was then the biggest tax increase by any state in American history. They collected less total revenues after the tax increase than they had prior. It didn't solve the budget deficit, it made it worse. Now watch what's going on. The tax increases imposed in this state were retroactive, meaning there was no way to adjust behavior. They get a full year of tax increases and nobody can adjust their behavior to avoid those tax increases. So you're right, they had a huge surge of revenues in December. In December, they collected $4.5 billion more in income taxes than they had December a year ago. Huge windfall. In January, they collected about $1.5 billion more than they collected in January a year ago. You know how much they collected in February? About $250 million more than February a year ago. You watch the March, April, and May returns, and my suspicion is we're going to see the same pattern again, that as people begin to adjust their behavior. And remember this maxim, there is nothing more portable in this world than money. I think that you're going to see the same pattern apply. Those tax increases don't help the economy, they hurt it. They hurt it massively. As I said, we see the job that is created by government when government puts that dollar back into the economy. What we don't see as clearly is the jobs that are destroyed or prevented from forming as that dollar is first taken out of the economy. We see those lost jobs in a chronic unemployment rate and in a stagnating economy. California is tied for the worst unemployment rate in the country. We also have, not coincidentally, among the very highest of the taxes in the country. That ought to tell you a lot about the damage that these policies are having.
I've been going to the MRP meetings, and I'm Native American. I'm Miwok from Yosemite, and so we have different issues, and our issue is that we don't want any more digging, any more like this underground walkway that, the whole area, the whole Yosemite was a site at one time. And so when you go down any depth at all, you're going to have some kind of impact. And I just feel like this turnarounds, these underground tunnels or walkways that we're looking at, in 100 years, start looking at this stuff for our children, you know, that's what's going to impact. And when that comes and that impacts that, that's going to be a lot lost. And so I don't know where the public has their input, and we also have our input too. And so I'd like to have you know our input, and that you listen to us as the native stewards of that land. You know, we were there long before our ancestors were there, before anybody else was there. So when we talk about taking care of the land, you know, all these things that are wanting to be taken out and stuff, those have been there for years and years too. But I'm talking about the devastation that digging, and it's like putting a footprint in. They want to take a footprint out, but they're going to put a bigger one in. And that's what concerns me. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Sandra Chapman.
Well, let me just point out that Native Americans are also Americans. Yosemite is owned by all Americans, and all the voices should be heard. But what I'm concerned about is the exclusionary policy that we see emanating from both the National Forest Service and the National Park Service. That's the people's land. They work for us, and they're supposed to be welcoming us. Boy, this side's pretty quiet. This side's pretty talkative.
Thank you for coming. My name is Ralph Mendershouse. I'm concerned about the lower Merced River. Behind you is the map, and you see the river really runs pretty much through the middle of the county. That's our river. It really is the public's river. It actually is a national river protected by national legislation. And I'm very concerned. If you look at the base of that, to the left, there's a lake. That's entirely in Mariposa County. That river, by the way, works very hard for Mariposa County, out in the park, in the valley, all along its course. There are a great many recreational uses, trails, and my guess is that in the future it will work even harder. That someday there will be a trail coming up along that entire waterway from University of California, Merced, from the city of Merced. People there will want to recreate, and this will be where they come. They already come, they will be coming more. I'm very concerned about, I believe it's HR 934, which you sponsor. You represent Mariposa County. That lake is in Mariposa County. I don't know what Mariposa County is getting from your legislation. I do know that river works for us, and I think your legislation threatens that river. So now up in the upper end, in Yosemite Valley, you seem to have a different set of values than you do down there. We do have a very clear line now between the Merced Irrigation District, which is in Merced County, and the recreation that we have up here. So I'd like you to address that question, because, and first of all, what is HR 934 going to do for Mariposa County? What are our benefits up here? And don't tell me that Merced Irrigation District is really inclined to share any possible gains with Mariposa County, because that really does not look very likely.
I rather think they'll sell to anybody who wants to buy, and it starts with Mariposa because it's cheaper to sell to Mariposa. No. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay, and so that is my first question, and my main question, but also I want you to address the future, as she was just saying. I mean, we're thinking long term here, of the future of our community and economic development. How does taking a piece of river and turning it into a reservoir, going from riparian habitat and changing that to a bat covering, how does that improve our future? Thank you.
Well, let me start with a couple of stuff. There's been a lot of frankly, fairly hyperbolic rhetoric associated with the bill. I've seen it compared to, we're planning to inundate the entire entire Yosemite Valley. All this does is to make about an 1,800-foot boundary adjustment in the lines for Lake McClure. When Lake McClure was established, there was a FERC, this Federal Energy Regulatory Commission boundary, because it's a hydroelectric dam. When the Wild and Scenic River designation was established for the Merced River, it actually overlapped onto the FERC boundary by about 1,800 feet. That shouldn't have happened. This simply adjusts the boundary back to where it should have been originally, so that it's contiguous and not overlapping. All of this is to simply accommodate a 10-foot increase in spillway at the new Exchequer Dam. What does that do for Mariposa County? It allows the capture during wet years of about 70,000 acre-feet of additional water that would otherwise be lost. That 70,000 acre-feet of water, just to put it in perspective, is enough to meet the annual needs of about 70,000 households, and it would produce about 1,700 kilowatts of electricity. Again, that's enough for the electricity needs of about 1,700 households. Hydroelectricity is the clean. I chair the Water and Power Subcommittee of Natural Resources. And I'd like to kind of walk through a couple of what I think are fairly self-evident truths involving water and power and try them out on you. Self-evident truth number one is more water is better than less water. We all agree on that. More electricity is better than less electricity. We all agree on that. Cheaper water and cheaper electricity is better than more expensive water and more expensive electricity. That's what this project is all about. And the hyperbole that I see attached to some of the opposition, that an 1,800-foot boundary adjustment simply to put the boundary lines where they should have been all along, up to the FERC boundary for Lake McClure, that will allow the temporary expansion of that lake during wet years, during about 8 weeks, to capture an extra 70,000 feet of water. I think that that's pretty clear. I mean, as you watch, the unemployment here is 13.2%. That is much higher than state unemployment, which in turn is much higher than the federal unemployment rate, which is at terrible levels. I would think that the prospect of more water, more electricity at a time when our water supplies and our electricity supplies are being stretched to the breaking point, and we're all seeing massive increases in our electricity bills as a result of this scarcity. The prospect of having 1,700 kilowatts of the cheapest, cleanest electricity we can produce and 70,000 acre-feet of additional water, that ought to be clear to the most hard-hearted environmentalists among us. I think it's a very reasonable, very modest bill.
Hi, I'm Pat Albert, and I live here in Mariposa, and I wanted to ask your questions about hiking permits for Half Dome. You mentioned those in your letter to Mariposa, and do you think they really would put a second cable up?
Third cable, yeah, but they won't. We just had that discussion. Because they've got two now.
No, well, they've got,
One on each side,
Well,
two cables.
no, you haven't
I
climbed.
haven't actually been up there, so I'll take your word for it.
No,
I was told there were
I
two.
climbed it twice, first
Okay.
when I was 15 and then when I was older.
Right.
And there's only one, and it's wide, you've got these planks, you go from one to the other. There's only one right now.
There's two cables on either side of
Yeah,
that.
well, the cables go up,
Two
but the
cables.
path going up is just one.
Well, I got
One cap, one set of
Two
cables.
cables.
Two cables.
One ladder.
One
You
line.
know, as you know, there are a lot of people who want to climb Half Dome. It's one of the lifetime experiences, for anybody who loves Yosemite and anybody who sees Yosemite loves Yosemite. There are legitimate safety concerns over too many people taking that path.
That's why they have the permit system going.
Well, but here's the thing. I mean, two things about that. Number one, simply putting a third cable up there would allow far more people to enjoy that experience. It's entirely permissible within all of the federal laws, and they won't do it. Interestingly, in the EIR, in fact, we had this discussion up in Yosemite a couple hours ago. The EIR says that there is no difference in, just with the two cables, there's no difference in safety between 300 and 400. You can accommodate 400 people there quite safely. That's what the EIR said. The Park Service decided to limit it to 300. And that gets back to this exclusionary, restrictionary attitude that I'm finding increasingly of concern of all the folks in this region, all the folks that visit our parks and use our public lands.
Well, my family did get a permit so that they can climb this summer in August.
Yeah, but I mean, just the exclusionary policies they now have, mean 100 folks a day are not going to have that experience. Just putting in a third cable would increase the capacity that much more, and I think that's a shame. I'm sorry, go ahead, sir.
Good evening. I write an economic blog, and I'm basically on the other end of the spectrum from you. I brought a two-pager for you. Can you read it?
Well, I would not have thinking about it.
Well, yeah, of course, yeah. I know that. Well, the other side of the political spectrum believes that we have a jobs crisis, not a federal budget crisis.
Well, no question. We have both, but you're right.
Right, well, they think that we should attack the bigger problems, the economy itself, and that when you grow the economy, then you grow taxation, and then you also balance the budget.
There's no disagreement on that point. I mean, revenues are an important part of the equation. Sorry to interrupt, I just want to agree with you. But before we get to the but, we agree completely on that. Revenues are an important part of the equation. There's a healthy and unhealthy way to generate revenues. The unhealthy way is to try to exact additional taxes in an economy that's already buckling under the strain. The healthy way is to remove the burdens on the economy, particularly the regulatory burdens that are holding back economic growth. And economic growth is the best generator of revenues that there is. So we agree on that point. But go ahead, now let's get to the point.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't have too much time to get into all that. I'm going to say, for the benefit of these people here, that in the year 2000, the federal government collected 20.6% of the GDP equivalent in federal revenue, and today it's 15.1%. So that's a drop in revenue, considerable. It's almost $900 billion. And if we had the same taxation rate as in the year 2000, which was a good year economically, the budget problem or the deficit problem would not be a topic. All right. I think I'll try to read this because, well, the answer would you read this?
Okay, but we don't.
Yeah, right. I can't read this instant.
Okay. It's about the fall off in private sector employment. I don't know if you realize that for almost 12 years, private sector employment was about 80% of all employment in the country. For 12 years, it was actually a negative number. And this is why the Progressive Caucus wants to attack that as the first priority for its recovering the economy, which is still reeling. Okay.
Well, again, government cannot create jobs because government cannot create wealth. What government can do is create the environment in which jobs either flourish or in which they wither. Government can transfer jobs from the private productive sector to the government sector. It does it by taxing the former and creating jobs in the latter. It can also transfer jobs within the private sector by taxing one industry and subsidizing another. But it can't actually create jobs because it cannot create wealth. It can transfer wealth. As I said, that is the difference between Apple Computer and Solyndra. Government can tax Apple and lavish subsidies on Solyndra. By doing so, government created 1,100 jobs at Solyndra. And as soon as the money ran out, Solyndra went bankrupt, and those 1,100 folks are still unemployed. That's the fallacy of the policies we've been pursuing. It's the fallacy of the policies that Herbert Hoover and George W. Bush pursued. Like I said, we've got plenty. This is not a theoretical discussion. We've got lots of experience with both policies. Reducing the burdens on the economy produces growth and prosperity, whether it's under a Democratic or Republican administration. Increasing the burdens on government, increasing the amount that the government is extracting from the productive sector, does enormous damage to the economy. So we know, again, whether it's under a Republican or a Democrat. I'm a lifelong Republican, but I got to look at the Bill Clinton economic record. Substantial reduction, 4% reduction in federal spending as a percentage of GDP. Huge cut in capital gains. Huge reform of entitlement spending. We had enormous prosperity. I think a strong case could be made that Bill Clinton's economic policy not only makes him the most Republican president we've had since Ronald Reagan, it makes him the only Republican president we've had since Ronald Reagan. My problem with Barack Obama's policies is not that he changed George W. Bush's policies. Quite the contrary, it's that he didn't change them. He took the worst of them and doubled down on them.
My name is Burnett Calhoun, and I agree with a lot that has been said here tonight. I've enjoyed bicycling and hiking and horseback riding, and I've also enjoyed our traditional ceremonies because I am also Native American. And I belong to the American Indian Council, and I'm a member of the Wahoga Committee. And we have, American Indian Council has been collaborating with Yosemite National Park staff for 36 years to build our traditional ceremonial roundhouse in a village called Wahoga, where they moved our people when it became a park. And it was approved by the General Management Plan in 1980.
I didn't know that.
Yes, it was approved, our roundhouse in a village, to be constructed there in the Wahoga site. We had a fund, a grant fund from Yosemite Fund, now called Yosemite Conservative. And so groundbreaking took place on June 9th of 2009. And then we started our roundhouse, and it was 1/3 complete when Mr. Newbacher came to a meeting with us, the Wahoga Committee here in Mariposa, and stated to us that we had to meet national building codes. But there are no building codes for a traditional ceremonial roundhouse that is proof of its stability. Now this would be the 3rd roundhouse that we have constructed. The first 2 were done by the Park Service themselves, and the first one stood for 20 years. The second one that we're still using today for our traditional ceremonies has been standing for 19 years. And over this 39-year period, everything that Mother Nature has put forth, snow loads, earthquakes, everything that are typical for Yosemite Valley have happened. And neither one of those collapsed or caused injury to anyone. So I'm here tonight to ask you if you would meet with the Wahoga Committee so that we could go into a more in-depth conversation with you.
I know you folks wanted to meet with me on this trip, but we were already actually booked.
I understand that, but I'm here again.
No, and you're top of the list.
I'll
be back quite often. It's not exactly a big sacrifice to come to this beautiful park.
No, it's not. It's like
So I can guarantee I'll be back here quite often. You're top of the list for meetings on my next trip. I didn't realize that project had actually been approved.
Yes, it's in the 1980 General Management Plan, and we met all the
obviously, the park needs to assure that the structures on it don't collapse and kill people. There's got to be some sort of way to compromise to assure that it's meeting all of the engineering standards without violating whatever religious edicts you have on construction.
Yes, I agree with that, except that, there's engineers learn from books, and there's no book that has a traditional ceremonial roundhouse in it.
But we've got experience building things over the millennia. I'm sure we can come up with a way to build something that won't fall down using whatever techniques are acceptable at the tribe. I don't see that as an insoluble problem. Again, a lot of this is 2,000 years ago, Cicero spoke of the arrogance of officialdom, and my experience has been it hasn't changed in 2,000 years. And I don't mean that in a character sense. I mean that in the sense that bureaucracies have a certain way of doing things, and they simply won't deviate from them. And that's one reason why In this country, we decided maybe we ought to have elected officials who are directly accountable to us actually running the government. That's the trust that you've given to me, and we will figure out some way to resolve that issue. I'm sorry I couldn't do it on this trip, but we will be meeting next week.
Thank you very much.
Right here. And by the way, that goes for anybody who's having a close encounter with any federal bureaucracy. I mean, one of the most important purposes we have in the district office is to act as an ombudsman. I mean, we're essentially your advocate to your government. If you're having a problem in any division of government, we've got a staff that spends its full time simply being sure that folks are being dealt with fairly. So if you're having an encounter with any of the federal agencies, call our office. And we can't guarantee an acceptable outcome to you, but we can guarantee that due justice will be given to your case. That makes sense? I can't guarantee results, but I certainly can guarantee diligence.
I'm Diane Wilcoxon. I'm actually the owner of bed and breakfast, so we are greatly affected by tourism, but I do not feel that that should be the main thing that decisions are made on. And we really have to look at the long-term effects of what we're doing with the land that we have entrusted to us at the moment. And specifically, I'd like to address the fact that the Merced River is a wild and scenic river. And that is to the greatest economic benefit to the county to maintain that. That is what people come to see in Yosemite.
Let me, if I could just interrupt you at the point. What does the measure do that detracts from the wild and scenic nature of the Merced River?
I think you're taking a short-term effect view of the effects of, okay, we're only changing a little bit of the river for, as you said, only 8 weeks of the year of having extra water. It's a very short-term view. What the long-term view is, you're affecting the habitat of an endangered species.
Explain to me, how does it affect the habitat? Because the areas, that 1,800 feet is already inundated during heavy flows. The only difference is that the increase in the spillway will increase the period for about, prolong the period for about 8 weeks. Also, all this does is to adjust the boundary line. Never should have encroached on the FERC boundary to begin with. And after that adjustment, if the project moves forward, it still has to go through and meet all the requirements of the Endangered Species Act, the Environmental Protection Act, the Clean Water Act, every federal environmental law, and believe me, we've got tons of them, still is in full force. All this does is to adjust the boundary where it should have been originally, and that was contiguous to the FERC boundary, rather than encroaching on it.
I believe this would be a precedent in changing something that has already been designated as wild. And that is I am very much against that kind of a precedent that could be used in many other places throughout the entire country.
I couldn't agree with you
And
more.
I do not think that the short-term benefit is worth the long-term dangers to that. And we have to protect what is still wild in our country and find other ways to address our needs.
Well, I agree with you completely. On one point, that this would be an historic precedent. It would be the federal government actually admitting that it made a mistake.
I disagree with you.
No, I understand you disagree, but again, I think I've laid out the rationale, and I think that most people are going to agree. More water is better than less water. More electricity is better than less electricity.
I have a question on that side, Thomas.
Yeah, this side's got extra questions.
Yeah.
I live on Liquor Court.
Ricky Francisco from New Gardens. I'd like to know
Park Management this afternoon and made it very, very clear that they have a public in rebellion, that they better recognize that they work for the public, not the other way around. I see several of the officials here tonight. I think I made that very, very clear. The second thing is, as I said earlier, standalone legislation that will forbid the construction of these facilities under any circumstances. I think the more likely approach is whenever funding for the national park. Remember, all appropriations bills start in the House. We can attach riders to any appropriations bill affecting the Park Service to simply prohibit the use of funds for the purposes of destroying these facilities. In addition to that, I sit on the Public Lands Committee, and I am going to be requesting a formal congressional investigation and full hearings on this subject before we move forward. So those are the steps that we've already determined to take. If you've got others, please let me know. What you can be doing right now is simply beating the drums. You need to complain loudly and clearly, not only to park management, send me a letter directly because I will be communicating at the higher levels of the Park Service in Washington. The more letters I've got, the stronger the case I can make to them. And far more important, the stronger case I can make to the chairman of our subcommittee that we have a formal congressional investigation into this whole matter.
We need to somehow get in there. The acts had merit when they were first passed, but they are being perverted. Their intent is being perverted by legislation.
With respect to timber, they've done enormous harm to our forests. I mean, the best example I can give of that is the Fraser Experimental Project in Colorado. There's an aerial photograph of the experimental project. They call it the red hand of death. And the reason they call it the red hand of death, you can imagine an aerial photograph of a beautiful green forest. In the middle of that is a handprint, a big red handprint. And what's going on there is this. They decided to in the same forest, to try and experiment. Practice the kind of sound, sustainable forest management practices that we have for generations, that is, thin the forest, carry that excess timber out of the forest, but leave the other part alone. That other part is the red hand. That was consigned to benign neglect. And what happened was it became so overgrown and choked that the trees there became entirely, they lost their resistance to disease, and in this case to pestilence, and that entire red hand was destroyed by the bark beetle. The reason it's red is all the trees there are dead. The surrounding trees that have been properly thinned were all thriving. That's the difference. So these policies have not helped our environment. They've done enormous damage to our environment. Just think of the hundreds of thousands of acres of beautiful forest land that are in cinder. When had we carried out that excess timber, many of them would still be thriving today, and so would our economy.
We feel the red hand of death in our back.
Right here. Well, again, 13.2% unemployment rate in Mariposa County. That speaks for itself.
And that and mining too. There's a lot of things we can do around here.
Yeah.
I'm Jim Dolsey from Mariposa. I attended 3 of the Yosemite Valley Plan meetings, and the amount of timber that they're going to have to cut in order to put their plan in place, it's got to be in the hundreds of trees in order to move everything they want to move. I don't see that as being a practical way of doing it.
I'm sorry, this is regarding
Merced River Plan, yes, yeah. And I wrote letters on the Townhall plan too. It's got a lot of flaws in the Merced River Plan, and it needs to be stopped and corrected. With that said, I'd like to change the subject to education of our children. We can't afford to educate our own children, yet we send money across the sea to other countries all the time. That's got to stop. We need to take care of our own first, and then other people.
And that is maybe we ought to stop sending money and arms to countries that want to do us and our allies harm. have a good answer to you. I don't know why we are continuing to send arms and aid to the Islamic extremists in Egypt today. I just don't get it. It is self-defeating, it is indefensible, and ultimately it's going to cost a lot of lives. I don't know how to answer your question. It is stupid policy. The only good news in that is that's within our power to change when we summon the political will to do so. But I can't excuse those policies. And this is not just a hit on the Obama administration. Bush was doing the same thing. When I asked them, the rationale is, well, if we stop sending them money, they'll stop liking us, and it's like, they already do. In Pakistan, I don't get it. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you. I don't think that one exists. Let me just touch on education, though, real quick. You said we can't afford to educate our kids. Actually, we can afford to educate our kids. I mean, I look at just the budget in this state, inflation adjusted, I believe we were spending now about 3 times per student. Inflation adjusted, what we were spending in the 1960s when we had a vastly higher quality of education. So it's not money that's the problem with our education system. We've got to look at something else. And I would suggest to you that the way the schools are managed today is radically different than the way they were managed in the 1960s. In the 1960s, teachers were in charge of the classroom.
Yes.
You want to find God on earth, it was a teacher in her classroom. She could choose the curriculum, the teaching methodologies, and she was held accountable. Because if you also wanted to find God on earth, it was a principal at her school. The principal had the authority to hire and fire. The principal had the authority to pay a good math and science teacher more than a good gym teacher, not because we don't like gym teachers, but because good math and science teachers cost more. If a parent had a complaint, the parent could take that complaint to the principal, and the principal had not only the authority to act on that complaint, but had a school board breathing down their neck to be sure that they did. And the school board was the ultimate authority. Those were the folks that you bumped into at the grocery store. All of that's now been shifted to Sacramento, much of that anyway, has been shifted to Sacramento and Washington in predictable results. We need to go back to the systems that work. It's a thing that I find so frustrating after all my years in government. We've got plenty of experience with these policies. I don't think there's really been a new public policy thought up in centuries. We've tried all of this stuff before. We know what works. We know what doesn't work. Putting the teachers back in charge of their classrooms, putting the principals back in charge of their teachers, and putting the school boards, the parents really, through the school boards, back in charge of their principals, that works. It works extremely well. Why don't we do that again?
Hi, my name is Peggy DeViser. I'm on the board of directors for the Mariposa Mountain Riders. I love to ride my horse. I ride my horse up in the park. I take many people up to the park. Every time I go to the park, we have tourists come up to us, ask us, where do we rent horses like these? I said, well, these are out in my backyard. I can get those. But we always tell them where to rent horses. That's something they enjoy. There's nothing more beautiful than to ride through the park on the back of a horse, in a convertible, or on the back of a motorcycle. You are one with nature. We see things that people never see. I ride in the back country. You get these tree huggers come up and they want to do stuff. They've never been in the back country. They don't even know what it's about. We help keep trails clear. We help maintain the trails. The hikers don't maintain the trails. The motorcycle riders, the bicycles, it's the horse people that help maintain these trails. Also, the Indians and the horses have been in this park since the beginning of time. And the Indians were our first stewards, and they knew how to take care of our park and our land. And they should still take care of our land and our park, because we wouldn't have the problems we have now if the Indians were taking care of our park. We live here because we love where we live. We love this park. If you take the amenities out of the park, you're taking revenue from the park, you're losing billions of dollars in the park. Billions of dollars that would come into our community, that would also, you're losing jobs, you're taking jobs from people that need these jobs. They depend on this. And to go and lose these things, I think, is criminal. I want my great-great-grandchildren to be able to enjoy the things that we've enjoyed. And also, I talked to George Radonovich, and he was telling me that there was a bill that he has worked on for years called the Right to Ride, and that it was shelved. That's a bill that needs to be passed. And also, President Roosevelt signed an amendment that horses would never be taken out of our parks. President Lincoln signed what you said, signed an amendment that the parks are for the public. We are the public. These are public lands. We have to fight for what we believe in.
And that's just public recreation in perpetuity. That was the wording I'm told.
But the park has done things very secretly, you know, and not let people know. They've already done some things up at the big trees that nobody knew about. Last year, I took a group up to the big trees, up to the outer loop. There was a tree across the trail, and we picked ourselves around. Well, coming back, the guys, we had our little handsaw, because they get a little upset if you start chainsawing the park. And we got the tree out of the trail. That was something that we saved the trail maintenance.
Some money.
Some money. But we did that. Maybe we shouldn't have done it, but we did it. But it was blocking the trail. So, anyways, and also with the education, we don't have, they used to do field trips up to the park. They don't do that anymore. What better education can you teach our children than to be firsthand and see these things? There's so many beautiful things in the park, and I don't want to lose this.
They do field trips to the park still.
Yeah, they do.
Yes.
A few years ago on the House floor, I gave a speech which basically encapsulated what I just said about the royal forests. It was a 5-minute speech on the House floor, carried by C-SPAN, so what, 12 people saw it or so. I got over 500 emails unsolicited within 24 hours, people, mainly in the West, with one complaint after another about these elitist exclusionary policies. And we're seeing that erupt now. My warning to the Park Service is better realize who you work for, because if you think that as park officials you're going to push the people out of the park, push you officials out of the parks, and find new people who will actually fulfill the mission of Yosemite Valley as defined by Abraham Lincoln 150 years ago.
Well, and also, you know, you have people that come from Europe and other states, and if there isn't recreation for them to do, you're going to have more fatalities in the park, you're going to have more people climbing the rocks, falling in the river, you're going to have more, the river, the water is pristine in the river.
If there's time, we'll do a second round. I just want to be sure everybody has a chance to, the residents spoke again, has a chance. So, thank you. And just keep saying that.
I'm Bill Tucker, member of the Mariposa Indian Council. I'll start from top of Half Dome. You said something about 400 people up on Half Dome. Little salamander up there. You go all the way up to top of Mona Pass. You go all the way up there, we have our spiritual walk. We have our culture, traditional gathering up on that mountain. The water runs LA, Fresno, Red Meadows, Bridgeport, down to San Francisco, Merced. We're right up on the mountain. Water runs all those directions. The water right now, we had to move our little camp last year. No water. You guys talk about water. This year might be a little worse. trees underneath, the sun coming down. Maybe that whole river gorge might be dry in 10, 15 years at quality. Because that's where they get their water. That runs into Hetch Hetchy. When it runs into Hetch Hetchy, the people use it at Falling Meadows. And this time of the year, they got a nice good lagoon on the other side of the river by the Soda Springs, which is nice and blue. It's iced up, snow on it, it overflows, and where does it go? Into the river. That there, you don't want to drink that water. That is part of the effluent from Falling Meadows. They have to get rid of aeration or evaporation. The Park Service had construction in there, putting the Curry stables in. They did some dynamite work in there. There used to be 3 soda streams in there, down at the Parson. Right now there might be 1, and it's got boards around it. We used to drink water out of it, didn't think nothing of it. But nowadays, you don't drink water out of it. There's no restrooms around there. So it's nice and closed, you know, use your imagination what's in that little enclosure. No restrooms. Come on down to Tenaya Lake. Tenaya Lake is the headwater of the Merced River. I asked about this question, and they said, well, Congress never passed that Tenaya Lake because it's too far out. But there's thousands of people go through that Tioga Pass. There's thousands of people that go to smell that Tenaya Lake and look at it. They've got antifreeze, they've got oil spill, they got whatever you want on that pavement, and the river is no more than, the lake is no more than 10, 15 feet away. When a little bit of rain comes along, it turns into nice, foamy, look like snow out there, and it runs into that lake.
I hate to hurry you around, but time's running on this, so.
Oh, okay. But then, they still got the new station in there and all that stuff. Chemicals on a boardwalk out there. You get down to, into the valley floor, we've got a lot of issues in there that we have to work with. But my other biggest issue is this, is that in El Portal, in the 50s, the 55s, in that area, our people used to live in that El Portal alongside the Crane Creek, all the way up to Big Meadows. Park Service traded Forest Service land. Our people at that time had numbers on them. They knew how many Indians or how many natives were in that area. I've been asking.
Well, sir, you with the Miwok group,
Yes.
We will be meeting with you on my next trip out here, which shouldn't be more than, I would think, 4 weeks at the most.
Okay,
so maybe we can discuss that there, but we're running short of time. I want to be sure everybody's wants to ask a question, say something, has that chance.
All right. So.
Okay? Unless you've got a question or something.
Well,
because I need, by the way, I need the education, but I suspect that most of the folks here are.
I got one question on that. But the thing is that the dam, we're talking about money for the kids, work for the people. Put us a fish ladder in there. Humboldt County right now is darn knocking down 3 dams.
4, actually.
4. So how would they like to see Exchequer be knocked down because of a fish ladder?
Well, again, I know a lot about the Klamath, 4 hydroelectric dams. The environmental left is trying to destroy. They produce 150 megawatts of electricity. The reason they say is because of declining salmon populations. I said, well, why doesn't somebody throw a fish hatchery? It turns out somebody did. At the Iron Gate Dam, they've got a fish hatchery that produces 5 million salmon smolts a year, 17,000 return as fully grown adults spawn in the Klamath River. The problem is they're not included in the population count. And then to add insult to injury, when they tear down those 4 dams, they're also they take the Iron Gate fish hatchery with it, and then you do have a catastrophic decline of fish population. I mean, some of these leftist policies are simply irrational. But fortunately, the people in the Humboldt Valley awoke to that danger. They completely turned over the Board of Supervisors that had approved that plan, and by a 5-0 vote, that Board of Supervisors just withdrew from that plan, which means that people raising their voices on these issues do ultimately prevail, and that's why I wanted to urge every one of you to do so with respect to this and all the other issues, particularly the Yosemite issue we've been talking about. And sir, we will continue this conversation because I do need this education, but I think a lot of the other folks don't, so we will continue that. Okay.
Speaking of time, we've only got time for this one last question because we're right up against the clock.
But by the way, I will stick around. If you've got questions, I'll stick around.
My name is Dwayne Bolsucci. I'm a Mariposa resident. I'm also an Iraq war vet, and I have PTSD. And I'm going to give a comment about the MRP and lead to a question, actually. So, in counterpoint to many voices here, I visit national parks and wilderness because there's solitude and unconfined primitive recreation. Horses, hiking, human-powered recreation. This is why I find national parks special. Frank Lloyd Olmsted, who was on the original Yosemite Planning Commission back in the 1900s, thought the highest value of a national park was in contemplative recreation, unconfined places to think and contemplate about yourself, outside of the city, not having a schedule, not having it be Disneyland with a tour guide telling you when and where you should be to be on the next trip or tour. I think the MRP is moving in the right direction of going to an unconfined recreation. You can still bring your personal horse, you can still bring your personal raft, you can rent a raft outside the park and bring it in if you want to set that business up and get a CUA. I feel like having 3 hotels, massive build-ups, 2 golf courses, tennis courts inside the valley is not what a national park is for. That's what a county park is for. If Mariposa wants those kind of facilities, they can build those facilities. There's 3 golf courses in Oakhurst and Madera County. So that's my comment on the MRP. Second, 20% of the per capita income of Mariposa County can be explained by protected public lands, wilderness, and national parks. We are the 14th highest county in the United States. For per capita increase, that's about $7,000 per person in your wallet from Yosemite. This is done by the study done by the Headwaters Association. My question to you, sir, you were talking about what can you do to get rid of government bureaucracy. It's been 5 years since we've had a federal budget. What are you, sir, going to do to fully fund the largest employer in Mariposa County? We've taken an 11% budget cut this year, an 8% budget cut last year, a 10% budget cut the year before. What are you going to do to fully fund the largest employer in Mariposa County?
Well, first of all, is funded by private contributions as well as by the entry fees paid and the concession fees that are paid by those who enjoy the park. I appreciate your desire for solitude, but when Gifford Pinchot founded the National Forest Service, he had a match the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. We talked about Abraham Lincoln's proclamation on Yosemite Valley, public recreation in perpetuity that Yosemite offers, they'll go elsewhere. And they won't be coming through Mariposa or Oakhurst or Forrestville or Sonora or any of the other gateways. That's the point. That's a very serious point. Also, you ask, well, what else can we do to fund the parks?
Fully fund.
And that the public lands are an important part of our economy. You bet they're an important part of our economy, which is why it's such a travesty that the federal government has destroyed a sustainable timber industry, which once produced a tremendous economic boom for this region, and at the same time maintain far healthier and safer forests than we have today. Freedom works, and it's time to put it back to work. I'm circulating a proposal right now to tie Forest Service, again, this doesn't involve the park, Forest Service revenues to the timber harvests that are done on public lands. That would mean a boon for the federal government because that timber belongs to the people of the United States. It would be sold on behalf of the people of the United States. That money would come back to the federal treasury and ought to be dedicated to the improvement of our national forests and management of our national forests. I think the same kind of thing could be done on the park system.
Is Congress going to pass a budget this year? Are we going to have continued resolutions for the rest of this administration?
We'll have continuing resolutions with my strong opposition if that happens. I think the continuing resolutions are a terrible idea. As you know, I serve on the Budget Committee. The last 3 years, the House has passed budgets that actually, the latest one that we just passed, balances the federal budget within 10 years, and within the next 30 years or so, pays off the entire national debt that is crushing our economy. The Senate has failed to act for the last 4 years until this year. The Senate budget is $1 trillion of new taxes. That's an average of $9,000 per family extracted from the economy. And it still never balances. Are those budgets going to be reconciled? To be honest with you, I don't think so. We've got a good process to do that, but it's not being employed. And even if it were, we all know that Congress right now is badly divided. And the reason that Congress is divided is because the American people are divided. That's what I was addressing at the very beginning. We are at a crossroads. We have two very different visions for the future, two very different paths we can take. I believe that one path leads us to the kind of crises that are now convulsing Europe. And one path leads to that kind of failed collectivist state that we're seeing now unravel in countries like Greece and Cyprus. The other path takes us back to those uniquely American principles of individual liberty, constitutionally limited government, and personal responsibility that produced the most prosperous and influential republic in the history, and happiest republic in the history of the world. That's what we're all talking about. That's the basic choice that we have. I'm as frustrated as you are that Congress is so badly divided, but remember what Abraham Lincoln said about that in 1858. Remember, he said that we were about to be visited by a crisis. That crisis, he said, must first pass. He said that we were a house divided against itself cannot stand. Remember what he said right after that? He says, I do not expect that the house will fall, but I do expect that it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Then there were two irreconcilable principles that were vying for the future of our country, freedom and slavery. And he understood that ultimately the two couldn't coexist. They were polar opposites. We had to become all one or all the other. I think that wheel's come full circle, and we now again have two entirely irreconcilable, polar opposite visions of the future, freedom and socialism. And our generation is being called upon by history to choose which path we're going to take. I believe that ultimately we're going to choose wisely. I can see that everywhere I go. There may be setbacks along the way, but ultimately the American people understand that freedom works and that it is long past time that we put freedom back to work. And ultimately, that's not going to be decided by Congress. It's going to be decided, as I said, by those debates that are going on in town halls like this. There are a bunch of us from Mariposa today who have very different views. And it's good that we're talking about them, because as you talk, I mean, what is debate? It's testing the validity of our opinions. And I want to thank all of you, because you've been tremendously civil to one another. With some very, very different viewpoints. But that's what we have to go to. We have to have that discussion as Americans. And ultimately, it's going to fall to this generation. What's happened in the country has happened on this generation's watch. Ultimately, it's going to be this generation's responsibility to set things right. I mentioned Lincoln a moment ago. When he was making his way to Washington to be inaugurated, he gave a little speech on the back of his inaugural train when we stopped in Indianapolis the first night of the trip to Washington. And a crowd gathered and came out visiting with the folks who were going out. And a stenographer took down these words and spoke to the crowd that night that I think were just as applicable, meant just as much for our generation right now at this moment in our history as it was for that crowd that he spoke to that March night in 1866, or pardon, 1861. He said of the American people, it may be said that when they rise united in defense of their union and its liberty, the gates of hell shall not prevail against them. I appeal to you, my fellow citizens, constantly to bear in mind that not with the president, not with the office holders, but with you is the question. Shall the liberties of our nation be preserved to the latest generation? I've looked at a lot of crowds in these town halls that I've done, and every time the answer comes back to me, this generation is rising to the occasion. This generation will set things right. We will restore and revive those American principles that build our country. So thank all of you for being here tonight. And I'll hang around for any other questions you